To Professor Garry Gregg. We introduced him last hour, so I won't introduce him again, but I just want to say one thing before Dr. Gregg comes back up. You know, the kind of debate that we heard in the last hour is exactly the kind of thing that the Hauenstein Center stands for. Vigorous debate, no litmus tests. We're going to hear from the left, we're going to hear from the right, we're going to hear from the center, but what I want is vigorous debate, answering tough questions, addressing tough questions. That's what the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies is about, and I would urge you to go to our website, which is changing rapidly every day as we enlarge it. Go to allpresidents.org, allpresidents.org, and stay tuned because you're going to see a lot of exciting things appear on that website. Well, with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Gregg.
Thank you, Gleaves, and thanks to the Hauenstein Center for hosting this today, and Grand Valley University for being such great hosts. Today I want to talk about words. I want to talk about rhetoric. I want to talk about presidential leadership, not in the way we've talked about it the last hour, except for making snide comments perhaps about the president's ability, the public speaking. What I want to talk about is leadership, symbolic leadership, rhetorical leadership, and comparing Franklin Delano Roosevelt's leadership following Pearl Harbor, the attacks on Pearl Harbor, with the leadership that we saw from President Bush following the attacks of 9/11. Gleaves mentioned in his introduction this morning about the president's role as chief of state. That's what I want to talk about today. On September 11th, 2001, President Bush dictated the following line in his diary: "The Pearl Harbor of the 21st century took place today." Keep that in mind as we go through this discussion and the question and answer period at the end. When I went through FDR's speeches after Pearl Harbor, and I went through very carefully Bush's speeches following 9/11, I found very important similarities that I think point us to some roles that we expect our presidents to play during times of crisis, during times of grief, during times when the American people needs a central figure to help set the tone for the country. And I also found some significant differences. And we're going to try to, in the limited time we have, to get into all of those, maybe the differences particularly during question and answer period. There's some core elements that I found in both presidents' public leadership. One was the attempt very early on by both presidents to project what I call resolve and reassurance. I'm going to talk about that first, then I'm going to talk about how both presidents seemed to want to share the public mind, to show the American public they were sharing in their basic values and emotions and beliefs. And then I want to talk about the educational role that I saw both presidents playing. First, let's start with resolve and reassurance. People under attack look to leaders, it seems to me, to project reassurance, to project resolve in the face of threats and chaos. We don't like to feel that we're being buffeted around in a world of blind force, Machiavelli would call fortuna, of fortune. We don't like to feel that we're not in control. And so leaders, we expect our leaders in time of crisis to say, I'm in control here, things are going to be okay, we're going to get through this. And you can see that clearly with Bush after 9/11, you can see it with FDR after the attacks on Pearl Harbor. But you can see it, interestingly, with FDR before Pearl Harbor is actually attacked by the Japanese. FDR, for several years before that attack, had mounted an educational campaign, and I'll talk more about this hopefully if we have time a little later, mounted an educational campaign to tell the American people, to warn us of what was coming, to warn the American people of the threat that Germany and Japan, the Axis powers, held for us, but also to say it's going to be all right. We're going to win this. We're going to be okay. We're going to get through this. You know, the life of a scholar can be, at least seem to the outside world, to be pretty boring, sitting looking at books and manuscripts and going nearly blind, reading old newspapers and things. But there's moments when being a scholar can be lots of fun and actually pretty exciting. I had one of those doing this research. And the moment occurred when I ran across a speech, a fireside chat that FDR gave. Listen to the date, and it might start to see the significance. On September 11th, 1941, FDR gave a fireside chat from the Oval Office exactly 60 years before Bush would use that same Oval Office to speak to the nation after the attacks of 9/11. And he was also speaking of a sneak attack on the United States. Back then, September 11th, 1941. This was an attack, German submarine attack on the U.S. destroyer Greer. And one of the things that he attempted to do in this was to project resolve, to project reassurance that it was going to be all right. But listen to what the language that he uses. And in the earlier, this is what makes it so much fun. In the earlier panel, we were talking about the Bush Doctrine and preemption, and the general tenor of that was how bad that is. I might call that the Roosevelt Doctrine now. Let's go back to September 11th, 1941, and this is from his fireside chat. He counseled the nation to avoid the fate of other free peoples who had fallen because they had, and I quote now, refused to look the Nazi danger squarely in the eye until it actually had them by the throat. Think about Bush and the argument to go into Iraq. And then he added, when you see a rattlesnake poised to strike, you do not wait until it is struck before you crush him. Very similar to what Bush said about Iraq and the argument for preemption. And again, my point of bringing this up is he attempted to show resolve and reassurance. He ended the speech with this, and with that inner strength that comes to a free people, conscious of their duty and conscious of the righteousness of what they do, they will, with divine help and guidance, stand their ground against this latest assault upon their democracy, their sovereignty, and their freedom. It's going to be okay. We're going to win this thing. After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, of course, he gave his famous speech the next day where he declared before a joint session of Congress that December 7th will be a date that will live in infamy. Other things he does in that speech is, again, to show that he's in charge, that he's confident that America is going to win. One of his lines early in the very short address, actually, was, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed all measures to be taken for defense. He's in control. Things are being done. I quote a couple of sentences here now. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of Congress and the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God. Flash forward now to 2001. Bush faced, and Gleaves mentioned this earlier today, the Bush faced a challenge unknown to FDR. And that challenge was finding out about the attacks. And remember how he found out. As Gleaves said this morning, he was talking to second graders at the Irma Booker Elementary School in Florida. The unforgiving cameras were there. The reporters were there. And remember, Andy Card leaned over to him, whispered in his ear this sentence, a second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack. And the president was faced with a situation. What does he do at that point? Does he get up and go? America's under attack, right? Does he get up and leave? Does he get on Air Force One? Does he convene a cabinet meeting immediately? What happens in this? And what's he do? Nothing. He just sits there. He sits there and listens to the second graders complete their reading lesson. And then only when that lesson's over, then he gets up calmly and leaves the room. And that's interesting, it seems to me, because it's sort of a symbolic leadership that he seemed to be trying to convey in his very body language. FDR didn't have that handicap. FDR found out about Pearl Harbor in the White House. Would that have made a difference? I don't know. But I did run across a note by Frank Knox, who was Secretary of the Navy, who had visited FDR on December 7th. And he said this. This is how he recorded that moment. He said he found FDR, quote, seated at his desk, and he was as white as a sheet. He was visibly shaken, Knox said. And then he added, I think he expected to get hit, but he did not expect to get hurt. Well, what we saw of FDR was then the next day. Very calm, resolute, strong, well-prepared. Bush didn't have that advantage. And so I think considering the circumstances, he did pretty good. You can see his eyes, if you look at that again, I watched this all very closely, you can see his eyes dart around, and he's a bit distant, a little shocked. But nonetheless, considering everything, he's pretty calm. And then he goes into the back room, and he takes out his Sharpie pen. He carries a Sharpie pen. I guess it's not an endorsement for television, but he carries a Sharpie pen with him all the time. And he wrote those first few sentences that he said with his Sharpie pen in the back room when he came out. And later on, he told a journalist about this event. He said this, I had to convince myself to be calm and resolute as possible because I know people were watching. It seemed to be he knew what was going on in that circumstances. We've already talked this morning a bit about how he flew then to Barksdale Air Force Base and landed there. And if you look at what happened in Air Force One, and some of that stuff's available now, the notes that were taken on Air Force One, it's really the president's idea to go down. And why? Because, he says, this is a quote from notes taken on Air Force One, I think it's important for people to see the government is functioning because the TV shows our nation has been blasted and bombed. The government is not chaotic. It's functioning smoothly. And so he goes down and we can argue whether he does a good job in that second address at Barksdale, the Air Force Base in Louisiana, but nonetheless, he's there. He then gets criticism for flying all around the western part of the United States, of course, and I think it's one of the anchors, Peter Jennings maybe, that criticizes him for sort of fleeing around the western part of the United States. And again, if you look at the notes that were taken on Air Force One, he seems to predict that that's exactly what's happening. He said, and I quote, he told a Secret Service agent, the American people want to know where their dang president is. And later when the Secret Service said, when he convinced him to get back to Andrews Air Force Base, to go back to Washington, they wanted him to take a limousine, or take a motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base to the White House and secretly get through. It's a much safer way than flying in that low landing helicopter. But President Bush told the Secret Service this, and I quote, I'm landing on the South Lawn in Marine One. People want to see me land in the South Lawn and go into the White House and go into the Oval Office, okay? It seemed to me he understood that we expect our leaders to see them unbowed, in charge, safe, and we saw the same with FDR and Bush, both in their rhetoric and in their actions. Secondly, let me go to a point about sharing the public mind, or representing the public mind, if you will. Representing, but what is representing is representing. The American people seem to expect the men who hold our highest office to reflect our values and our most profoundly felt emotions. FDR, again, had an advantage on this point, it seems to me, because when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, he had led the American people through the Great Depression. We understood. Of course, I wasn't old enough to be around then. We, the American people, understood that he was one with us. He understood our pain. He understood what we were going through. He understood our values and our beliefs and was with us. And so when the attacks of Pearl Harbor happened, it's not that dramatic of a change, it seems to me. It is a very dramatic change with George W. Bush. And just go back and think about those few months in office, first few months. He was only in office for 8 months. He had been considered by some, at least, as being not a legitimate president. You know, all the problems we had in Florida and all that kind of stuff. He had been painted by his critics as being only concerned with the rich because of his tax cut. If you remember, what's he do in August of 2001? Something unprecedented for recent presidents, certainly compared to Clinton. He takes a vacation, and not only a vacation, he takes a month-long vacation. He goes away for a month. He takes all kinds of criticism. That's right before the attacks, and so the change is really fairly dynamic dramatic with Bush. Let's go back to FDR, though, and start there. For years, as I said earlier, FDR had been waging a campaign to educate the American public and to build support for a war against the Axis powers. He had not been very successful in that. If you look at the public figures as I have, the public polling numbers, he had moved the public somewhat to an understanding that we needed to be in this war, but by no means a majority. Considerable amount of the public was isolationist, considered him a warmonger, considering trying to get in this war to build his own power. Much of it you see in the same language used today against President Bush. But what Pearl Harbor did was give FDR the chance to bind with the American public in the public's mind. They were one. The war was no longer an abstraction, it was a reality, well felt by the American people. In that December 8th address, he said, "The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications of the very life and safety of our nation." You can ask in 24 hours how he knows that, but he knows that because he feels the American people. He knows the American people. And we're attacked, sneak attack like that. He knows what we're feeling, and it's the same as he's feeling. And he went on to say that the American people's, quote, righteous might will win this, will prevail. During his radio address 2 days later, which was December 9th, he claimed, no honest person today or 1,000 years hence will be able to suppress a sense of indignation and horror. He was feeling it. The American people were feeling it. I deeply feel, he said, the anxiety of all the families of the men of our armed forces and the relatives of people in cities which have been bombed. He uses what we call the royal we. We, the American people. Us. He is one with them. Consider this couple of sentences from his State of the Union address, which is January 6, 1942. The act of Japan at Pearl Harbor was intended to stun us, to terrify us. The plan has failed in its purpose. We have not been stunned. We have not been terrified or confused. And he goes on in that kind of language. Fast forward now to 2001. And I think this is, if you have to look at a central element in Bush's transformed relationship with the American people, it's this aspect of sharing the public mind, sharing the public values and beliefs. Not everyone, of course, he would continue to have detractors, but it seems to me he gave voice to a very large public that was anguished, that was prayerful, that was then emboldened and resolute, demanding justice, and he seemed to feel all those same emotions, it seems to me. On September the 11th, that evening, at the Oval Office, this is another interesting quirk of history, is he sat at the very same desk, and not only those two speeches that I mentioned, FDR and Bush, occur in the same room, they occur at the same desk. And that desk is made from the timbers of a ship called the HMS Resolute. It all comes back. At that desk, he expressed what he's called the, quote, disbelief, terrible sadness, and quiet, unyielding anger that he had detected taking part or happening in the American psyche. The classic moment, of course, as you all know in this, is the moment when he's at the World Trade Center. And he's at ground zero, and he's got his arm around the firefighter, and he's got the malfunctioning bullhorn. This is a very slick White House, but in that case, they got a bad bullhorn, which worked out to his advantage because he tried to speak to them. Remember, they couldn't hear him, and so they're yelling, "They can't hear you!" And then he says, which is not actually elegant, but in the moment, it became a rallying cry. And you saw this on signs and bumper stickers, and I know in Louisville there was a printer that came around and did this big poster with these words on with the flag and stuff and just gave out posters. "I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock down these buildings will hear all of us soon." And then the chants start, USA, USA, USA. Jonathan Alter was there. If you know Jonathan Alter, he is a Newsweek reporter. And he instantly, at that moment, turned to someone next to him and said that this is a turning point in history. A turning point in history. And whether it's a turning point in history or not, it certainly was a turning point in the Bush presidency. And what he did with then his, that kind of language and the language that we heard from him in days to come, it seems to me, is he built trust with the American people. And built trust in such a way that even with a delayed military response, even with going out now 2 years, and now the polling numbers are changing, so let's say a year and a half without Osama bin Laden caught, etc., he remained enormously, historically popular. And Bush seemed to understand that himself. He told journalist Bill Salmon, in retrospect, he said, and I quote, "I guess that's what America appreciated. I was expressing their sentiments. America was hot, and we were sad. We cried." Now, presidential leadership has to be about more than representing the public mind, however, representing our views and values. Presidential leadership has to be about teaching as well, it seems to me. FDR himself called the presidency, and I quote, "preeminently a place of moral leadership." That's a very famous quote from FDR. But what's less famous is what he added to that no one talks about. So he called it preeminently a place of moral leadership, and he added that, and I quote, "All our great presidents were leaders of thought, not action, but leaders of thought, at times when certain historic ideas in the life of the nation had to be clarified." The attacks of the Japanese at Pearl Harbor and the attacks of the terrorists on 9/11 gave both Bush and FDR a chance to really be teachers to the American public, it seems to me. I will deal with on several aspects, as many as I have time to today, on this sort of teaching function, because I think it's important. Number one, let's talk about how they both attempted to define the enemy, which seemed to me important. Defining the enemy. His address on December 8th, that is that famous address we talked about, he called the Japanese enemy deceitful and tricky, and called the attacks unprovoked and dastardly. What's usually forgotten, though, and I mentioned this before, is almost no one realizes, no one remembers, that he did a very important address on December 9th, a fireside address. And in fact, fireside chat, and this was his idea. His aides wanted him to do a long address before Congress, much like Bush did on September 20th. He said no. He needs a short address to set the tone, and then the next night I'll come back to the American people. And he doesn't say do the teaching function, but that's how I'm categorizing it today. And that's what that second address is really about. In it, he demonizes the Japanese, and this will be kind of surprising perhaps to some of you, for how really harsh his rhetoric is. And I argue much harsher than actually George Bush's was. He called the attacks criminal. He said they were a climax of a decade of international immorality. He called the Axis nations powerful and resourceful gangsters. He said not only must the shame of the Japanese treachery be wiped out, but the sources of international brutality, educating on the scope of this war, wherever they exist, must be absolutely and finally broken. In his State of the Union address, Remember, Bush got into trouble in the State of the Union address calling the axis of evil, using that phrase. In his FDR's State of the Union address, he called the Japanese cold and calculated killers. I'll read two excerpts from that speech. "We must not underrate the enemy. He is powerful and cunning, and cruel and ruthless. He will stop at nothing that gives him a chance to kill and destroy. He has trained his people to believe that the highest perfection is achieved by waging war. For many years he has prepared for this very conflict, planning and plotting and training and arming and fighting." And then he pits the, what's this war about? And he says this war is about in defending freedom, democracy, family, common decency, and humanity. And then, again, to the modern ear, this is pretty radical language. You can imagine Bush using it. He focused the war then as a battle between religion and irreligion. And here's what he said. "The world is too small to provide adequate living room for both Hitler and God. In proof of that, the Nazis have now announced their plan for enforcing their new German pagan religion all over the world. A plan by which the Holy Bible and the Cross of Mercy would be displaced by Mein Kampf and the swastika and the naked sword." No mincing words with FDR here. Now fast forward to 2001, Bush's speeches. And I assume these are all on your mind, and so I'll just throw out the words, wanted dead or alive, evil, calling bin Laden the evil one, calling them cowards, and then all the debate, we saw a little bit of it this morning, of whether, do you call this, you hail it as moral clarity finally in the president, or do you say this is reckless, infantile sort of rhetoric? I don't want to focus on that right now. We can talk about it maybe, question and answer. But what I want to focus on is another aspect of the Bush that's clear when you look at the Bush's speeches and his symbolic actions, in that he was attempting very clearly to avoid a problem that his aides at least say that he and the White House understood from World War II. And that is to make sure that Islamic peoples in the United States were not treated as the Japanese were in World War II. And how did he do that? Several ways. Let me tell you, go through a few quickly. He included an Islamic cleric, remember, at the National Prayer Service. He went into the largest Islamic center in Washington. Remember when that happened? He took his shoes off, and he went in, and he read from the Quran, and he declared, "The face of terror is not the true faith of Islam." This is teaching. And then he said, "Islam is peace. These terrorists don't represent peace, they represent evil and war." He hosted an iftar dinner at the White House to begin the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. In his famous September 20th address before the joint session of Congress, he separated the terrorists from Islam by saying, and I quote, that the terrorists practice a fringe form of Islamic extremism that has been rejected by Muslim scholars and the vast majority of Muslim clerics. And then he spoke to the world. He spoke to adherents of Islam, Arab countries around the world, but I invite you to imagine, I think it was, he was speaking back to us. I quote, I'll read a few sentences here. "We respect your faith. It's practiced freely by many millions of Americans and by millions more in countries that America counts as friends. Its teachings are good and peaceful, and those who commit evil in the name of Allah blaspheme the name of Allah. The terrorists are traitors to their own faith, trying in effect to hijack Islam itself. The enemy of America is not our many Muslim friends. It's not our many Arab friends. Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them." He was not only defining who the enemy was, but defining who the enemy was not. Now we can ask the question, did FDR do that? And the answer is actually what I found is yes, he did, to a very small degree. But I did find some speeches, some minor speeches where when word had come to him that immigrants were being mistreated around the country, not given jobs, being fired, that kind of stuff, that he did give speeches where he where he says, this is a bad thing, this doesn't help America, let's stop doing it. I'm going to have to wrap up in just a second, so let me say, just focus on one more, and that is preparing the nation for war. The President's role in this educational role of preparing the nation for war. On December 9th, that famous, not famous, but should be famous address by FDR that I mentioned, one of the first things that he does is invite all the American people, and I quote, every single man, woman, and child to be part of the war, to discuss, and I quote, the defeats and the victories, the changing fortunes of war together. And he told the American people to, quote, reject all rumors. And they did an interesting thing that I found, and I can't imagine, again, a president doing this today, but he spoke to journalists. And he said this to journalists, that you as journalists have a, and I quote, a most grave responsibility to the nation. Again, he's teaching, preparing for the war. And that they have, the journalists, have no right in the ethics of patriotism to deal out unconfirmed reports in such a way as to make people believe that they are the truth. Journalists would not be exempted from what he thought to be the responsibilities of every American. And he says, every citizen in every walk of life shares this same responsibility. The lives of our soldiers and our sailors, the whole future of the nation depend upon the manner in which each and every one of us fulfills this obligation to our country. He then went on in a very detailed way and very protracted way to lay out what this war would be like, that this war would be long, that this war would be hard, that sacrifices would have to be made. At one point during the speech, he used this line, on the road ahead there lies hard work, grueling work, day and night, every hour, every minute. He's calling for sacrifice, and this is, Gleaves will appreciate this, being an old wordsmith as he was. He doesn't want to talk about sacrifice, though. Bad word, I guess, sacrifice. So what's FDR do? He changes sacrifice, what we would understand to be sacrifice, into privilege. And he says, the United States does not consider it a sacrifice to do all one can, to give one's best to our nation, when the nation is fighting for its existence and its future life. Rather than sacrifice, such difficulties, he said, would be a privilege. It's not a sacrifice for any man, old or young, to be in the Army or the Navy of the United States. Rather, it is a privilege. It is not a sacrifice for the industrialist or the wage earner, the farmer or the shopkeeper, the trainman or the doctor to pay more taxes, to buy more bonds, to forego extra profits, to work longer or harder at the task of which he is best fitted. Rather, it is a privilege. It is not a sacrifice to do without many things in which we are accustomed if the national defense calls for doing without it. Now, this is something, when we fast forward to 2001, we can ask the question, did Bush miss this opportunity, as some said, and I'll leave that up to your thinking about it. But if you look at his rhetoric was about normalcy, right? It wasn't about sacrifice, it was about take your vacations, get on the planes, fly again, go back to work, everything is going to be okay, hug your kids and all that kind of stuff. But it was a rhetoric of normalcy. And so you can ask the question, did he miss a moment when he could have called us to higher service? Perhaps. But what he does do, and what the New York Times on September 19th criticized him for not doing, the New York Times on September 19th in the lead editorial said that he was, quote, inflating expectations, and then went on with this line. The hotter the rhetoric is now, they're claiming it's too hot, too bellicose, too angry. The harder President Bush will find it later for his better judgment, if his better judgment winds up telling him to delay action or to concentrate for a while on diplomatic and economic sanctions rather than military force. As I went through these speeches, though, and very carefully did them, what you find is a very balanced rhetoric, I think. We remember the warmongering stuff. We remember that. But do we remember all the, what I call the sort of the softer side of Sears of his leadership? Do we remember his his setting up the Fund for Afghan Children when he, 4 days, I believe it was, after the start of the war. And do we remember that day on September 13th when he said, if you remember this, September 13th at the Oval Office when he's having a press availability, and he's talking on the phone to Tony Blair, I think it is, and he gets asked a question about what's he feel about the families and the children of the victims, and he says, I'm a loving guy. And then he catches himself, tear comes to his eyes, do you remember this? And I'm a loving guy, but then he stops himself, he says, and I'm someone, however, who's got a job to do, and I intend to do it. That seems to me that represents what Bush was doing in all of this. Where did he start the war from? Where did he tell us the war was starting from? Not the Oval Office, but the treaty room. Interestingly, I think. The treaty room where he said, where American presidents have worked for peace. And out the back, it's a beautiful Sunday morning out in the back, and I believe actually you can see a kite flying in the back, and the Jefferson Memorial, and it's all green and pretty and soft, and yet he's telling us we've just declared war in Afghanistan. He sets up the Fund for Afghan Children and asks all American children to give $1. Laura Bush becomes the first lady in history to deliver a full radio address on November 17th. After weeks of radio addresses attacking Afghanistan and very militaristic, Laura Bush comes in with a softer, let's think about the children, let's think about the women under the Taliban in Afghanistan. Think about the war itself as well, in this weird world that we had at that moment where B-52s were bombing the bejesus out of the caves and the Taliban forces, and then other planes were flying over dropping aid. That to me is, again, this other representation. If you look at his rhetoric, it's this softer side, this compassionate side, as well as the harsher side. In conclusion, does all of this matter? I think it does. It matters what presidents say. It matters how presidents act. They are our chiefs of staff, our chiefs of state. They are our symbolic leaders. But beyond that, it matters because what presidents say influence policy. We have this general worldview that you have this great policy and then presidents say these words about it. And in reality, quite often, presidents say words and then we get a policy out of that. So it matters. And we should think about, crisis will come up in the future like this, and it seems to me we should think about what types of characteristics that our presidents will hold that will allow them to provide what I think in both cases, and you can argue about the Iraq and all that kind of stuff now, but I think in both cases rhetorically, FDR and George W. Bush did a heck of a job symbolically as our chiefs of state. And let me stop there and see in the next few minutes if there's any questions or comments or arguments from the floor.
Much of what you tried to do in your speech, I have my students do, where we evaluate both FDR and Bush. One of the major differences that I see is that my students can fully appreciate how their grandparents needed to trust FDR. Not knowing what was happening, not having nearly as much information in that time as my students do now, they could appreciate their grandparents' need for trusting their commander-in-chief. Unfortunately, my 11th graders do not trust Mr. Bush. How do you account for that difference in those two individuals?
Well, I think part of it goes, you make an excellent point about just information. And in a world where you have limited information, you have no choice but to trust. I mean, you really have to trust in that. I think that's part of it, for sure. It's also a part when I tried to make a point earlier that I think FDR had 8 years of bonding with the American public. 8 years of, he does get it. He does, he's doing the right thing for me. And the American people felt that way in this depression. So it's 8 years of sort of bonding in a crisis. You don't have that with Bush. You just have that after 9/11. We also live, it seems to me, in a more partisan age than we did then. You have a shooting war at that point as well, and the constant reminders of, I mean, this is a shooting war, but it's with the Japanese and the Germans and the kind of rhetoric that I just mentioned of FDR, it's difficult not to say we all understand we have to really work hard, kick butt over there, or they're coming after us, sort of thing. Now it's, that sort of was the instant reaction for the first few months when the first. Let me remind you, though, that Bush's popularity lasted longer than FDR's did by a long stretch. Long stretch. His rally effect after 9/11 is just ending now, so they might not trust in that way. But Bush ended up much more popular than FDR was. The trust thing may be a bit different we can talk about. But Bush ends up 18 points, I believe it was, higher jump than FDR's, and then lasts well over a year longer. So it's, it's sort of a mixed bag on that. Go ahead.
I would like you to comment about what you think the difference in the media between the time that FDR was. I was 7 years old in 1942, and I distinctly remember the fireside chats, and everybody sat around their radio and listened to them. And the difference now in the huge number of media that we watch and the effect that has on what we, the American people, are we more confused with more information, or have we changed so much that information overwhelms us? It seems to me that in some ways we often just say, oh, I'm so little I can't do anything and I'm going to tune out. And actually that is what's happening in the United States as the voting. But the whole effect of the media difference when FDR was president and Bush was president.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's clear that it seems to me clear that we're oversaturated with the media. Our presidents show up too much. I mean, this is really even more of a problem for Clinton. I mean, Bush didn't have this until 9/11. Then when 9/11 happened, he's all over the place, and he continues that sort of more visible pattern. But FDR was. We didn't have him in our face all the time. We didn't have him. The fireside chat was a special time because he wasn't on all the time. You didn't see him on the news every night. And you also had the media ethic. I mean, let's face it. He lived in a world where he was handicapped. He couldn't walk. But the media didn't tell the American people that. And now it's every flaw. It's a much more difficult job, it seems to me, being president now than it was pre-television age and pre-Watergate age. That's the other moment when the press become vicious, anti-establishment. Whoever's in there, we're going to tear him down. Where FDR didn't have to deal with that. So I think the media is another very good point to say.
I found the parallels between FDR and President Bush very interesting, but in response to that, Dr. Gregg, my question for you is, how do you think the state of the country would be different and the leadership would be different had the votes been interpreted differently and Gore been in office? And what I'm asking, in essence, is how much of Bush's symbolic leadership of which you speak can be chalked up to his character as a man, and how much of it is just a response to the situation?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. It's an excellent question. Most political scientists deal with this thing that I mentioned earlier called the rally effect, and if you don't know what that means, it's just when a crisis happens, they tend to think we rally around the flag and the popularity of the president goes up. True. That seems to me doesn't fully answer the question, though. For instance, the question of why Bush's popularity went up to the highest in history, why it lasted, where every other rally in history ends in a couple of months. His lasted almost 2 years during a time of economic downturn. This, it seems to me, cannot be chalked up to, it just happens because it's the rally. Something's different happening here. And now, what would happen with Gore? I don't know. I can't. I could give you a guess, but it wouldn't be fair to give you a guess on that. And I don't know. I mean, it's a great question to think through, and we don't know what it would have been.
You focus your remarks on both presidents talking to the American people. You thought at all about the differences between the way that each of the presidents reached out to the other nations in the time of war?
No. I mean, I can see where you're getting with the question. It's a great question, too, and I just haven't thought of it. Do you have a thought? You want to opine?
Well, I mean, one of the criticisms of President Bush is that we find ourselves in a position where it's very difficult now to go back to the nations that we more or less spurn. I don't know enough about FDR and how he handled that same situation to have an opinion, but...
Well, let me, I don't know either, but let me end with sort of related comment. Not quite related, but I'll use it to pretend it's related anyway. Because I said I'd do some differences. Let me do one major difference. And one major difference is FDR's use of Pearl Harbor and the Japanese attacks versus Bush's. And that is what I discovered. Go back 2001 and remember, okay, 2001 it happens. What happens 6 months later? We have a ceremony at the White House, right? What happens 6 months after that on the one-year anniversary? We have a massive day of ceremonies, right, commemorating 9/11, ending with his standing in front of the Statue of Liberty, that beautiful backdrop of the Statue of Liberty, powerful backdrop. Bush goes through reminding the nation always of 9/11 and what's happened. And FDR not only didn't do that, but he absolutely refused to do that. And so this is a difference here. You can talk about why that might be. But he, on the one-year anniversary of Pearl Harbor, he said nothing publicly. Zero. Nothing. On the second-year anniversary of Pearl Harbor, he gave a communique about to Winston Churchill, or about a meeting that Winston Churchill and he had with the Turkish ambassador or something like that. No connection whatsoever. And then in 1943, which is the same year that one happens, Congress passes a bill that sets up December 7th as an Armed Forces Appreciation Day, forever commemorating it. What's FDR do? He vetoes it. He vetoes it and says this is inappropriate. So there is a massive difference between the Bush administration and the way we are commemorating and continuing to commemorate 9/11, though it was much more subdued yesterday, if you watch it. Very subdued. In fact, the most visible the president was, it seemed to me, was when he walked out and he just silently stood in prayer at the front of the White House and turned around, Cheney and him and the First Lady and Lynn Cheney, and they walked back into the White House. Didn't say a word. Very dramatically downscaled from last year. But I should wrap up with that, and thank you all for having me here in the Hauenstein Center, Grand Valley State.
Well, thank you, Professor Gregg, for your characteristically perceptive remarks. Now I'm really eager to read that 6th book, so hurry up. I just want to do a little housekeeping here and let you know what's on the agenda now. It's available inside this pamphlet. If you pick one up in the back of the room, you'll be able to follow the day's events. But we're going to have lunch at 11:30 in an adjacent room, 215, 216. And then there will be an afternoon panel discussion at 1 o'clock in 250 on this floor. It's over in the Grand River Room just across the hall. And then after that, there will be a tour of the Ford Museum in downtown Grand Rapids. And I see the director of the Ford Museum is here with us, Professor Dellenbach, so he can be there as somebody you can talk to as well this afternoon. And with that, if there are no questions about what's on the agenda today, I think we should adjourn and take a little break and then come back for lunch. No questions? Well, thank you very much.